Chapter 20. Mary, the mother of Yeshua's bedtime story titled Angel, Eve, and Carlo, channeled by Daniel Scranton.
I am Mary, mother of Yeshua. I am here to tell you a story. And it is a story of motherly love. There once was a woman named Angel. And Angel was a very sweet and loving woman. She met a man and they got married. And Angel had a daughter. Her daughter's name was Eve. When Eve was just a little girl, just 3 years old, her father died in a car accident. And Angel and Eve were on their own. Eve had many nights where she cried herself to sleep. An angel would be there to hold her, to love her. She loved her daughter unconditionally. As a result of the accident, which was the other driver's fault, Angel received a huge settlement from the insurance company of the other driver. It was enough for the two of them to live comfortably. And so Angel did not have to work. She got to be a full-time mom. A couple of years after the death of Eve's father, she needed to go to school. Angel brought her to school on that first day. And Eve was very sad. She did not want to be away from her mother. But she went to kindergarten. Despite her tears and her objections. And she actually began to enjoy going to school. She made friends. Her teacher was fair. And she enjoyed playing at recess the most. Sometimes Eve and some of the other children would be bullied by a much larger boy. His name was Tommy. And one day Eve, with all of her pent-up anger about her father's death still inside of her, took it out on Tommy when he was bullying another child. She picked up a rock and she threw it at him. It hit him in the back, and he was hurt. The teacher and the principal were very concerned, and they called Angel in for a conference and spoke with her about Eve's behavior. They asked Angel to punish Eve appropriately, and Angel swore that she would. And on the car ride home, Angel asked her daughter, "Why did you throw that rock at Tommy the bully?" And Eve answered honestly, "He is a mean boy. I do not like him. He says mean and hurtful things to everyone." And Angel recognized that her daughter was standing up for not just herself, but the other children as well. She did not want to punish her little girl. She wanted to understand. She wanted to help Eve, to help her learn how to forgive and how to have compassion. But Eve was still feeling a lot of anger, and she wasn't easy to reach. She started acting out at home as well, refusing to clean up after herself, refusing to eat her vegetables. She would be very difficult at bath time, and it was very hard for Angel to get her to brush her teeth. Eve was still carrying around so much pain from her father's death, and she didn't know how to deal with it. And when she would act out, when she was difficult, Angel employed a trick. Angel would remember holding Eve in her arms as a baby. And the way that Eve would look at her with such love, and the way that Eve would smile at her. She knew that the Eve she remembered as a baby was still there. She was still present within her angry and sad little girl. And so she would hold that vision of Eve, and eventually Eve would come around. She would change right before her mother's eyes. She would brush her teeth, eat her vegetables, take a bath, and clean up after herself. And then finally they could talk about what was really bothering Eve. Eve said to Angel, her mother, "Life is not fair. Daddy is gone. And bullies like Tommy exist. They get to be here. I have to put up with him. And I don't get to have my daddy. It's not fair." And Angel held Eve in her arms and agreed with her and said, "It's not fair. And it's good that you feel your feelings. It's good that you feel that anger. But you have to feel it completely. And when you do, you will then be able to realize that, like you, Tommy has also experienced a lot of sadness. He has an older brother, as it turns out, and his older brother is abusive towards him. And then Eve looked at her mommy and said, "I did not know that." That's very sad. Now I have something else to feel. And they hugged and they cried and they remembered Dad as he was, a beautiful, kind, and loving man. Eve continued to grow, and time passed. Before Angel knew it, she was a teenager. She was interested in boys, and she was on her cell phone quite a bit, texting with friends, posting her photos. Angel could feel that Eve was becoming her own person, and less interested in cuddling with mommy and even talking to mommy. And so Angel employed her trick when Eve was ignoring her and on her phone constantly. She remembered what little Eve was like as a baby, and she imagined holding Eve in her arms, seeing that love and joy in her eyes, and remembered hearing her laugh for the first time. And she would notice that when she would employ her trick, Eve would start to change right before her eyes. She would become more communicative. She would even ask her mother how she was doing. She would put her phone down and the two of them could sit together and have a meal and laugh. And then before Angel knew it, Eve was old enough to go off to a university. She got into a good one, and it was expensive. And so, with the insurance money dwindling down, Angel decided that it was time to restart the career that she had before Eve was born. Angel had gone to law school, and she was a lawyer, but she realized at this point in her life that she needed to be doing something that was fulfilling. She needed to feel that she was making a difference in the world. And so she applied for a job as a public defender. Now, Angel had gone to one of the best law schools, and she had worked at one of the biggest law firms before she got pregnant with Eve. And so the city was happy to hire her as a public defender, given her resume, even though she hadn't worked in 18 years. And Angel began to explore the new life that she was in with an optimistic outlook about being able to help the unfortunate. People who deserved good legal representation but couldn't afford it. Early on in her career, she did a lot of plea bargaining. And she was able to get a lot of people who were certainly guilty, lesser sentences. And then she ran into a case that was very challenging for her. She was asked to represent a man who was accused of murder. And she was very reluctant to take the case at first. She felt conflicted because the evidence was certainly pointing towards his guilt. And yet she knew that this was her job and that she had signed up to do it. The man's name was Carlo. And she met with Carlo for the first time and asked him several questions about the night of the murder. He seemed proud of himself for having been able to murder someone. And he was disrespectful to Angel. He made lewd comments, sexual in nature, towards her. And she liked him even less after that first meeting. She drove home that night with a terrible feeling in the pit of her stomach. She wondered how she could represent this man, a man who was obviously guilty and showed no remorse for what he had done. A man who didn't even appreciate that she was there to help him. And she went home that night and ate very little for dinner, drank a glass of wine, and as she lay in bed, she had that feeling in the pit of her stomach. She didn't know what to do. And so she closed her eyes and she just breathed into that feeling. She allowed herself to feel the fear that she had of this man. And then she allowed herself to feel the sadness for the other man, the man that he had murdered. And eventually she felt clear of those emotions, and she was able to drift off to sleep. The next day, Angel had to start to prepare a case for Carlo. and her mind was clearer. She was able to see some things that she could not see before. And she felt renewed in her desire to help Carlo with his case, to maybe get him a good deal with the prosecutor so he wouldn't spend 30 years in prison, becoming an even harder person and an even more skilled criminal. And so she had her strategy, her approach for getting Carlo a reduced sentence, and she went to him with it. And Carlo refused to hear anything about a plea bargain. He said, "I want to beat this. We are going to trial." An angel pleaded with him and said, "You know, I do not think that I can win this case for you. As your lawyer, I have to urge you to take any deal that we get from the prosecutor." Carlo refused to hear anything of the sort. He said, "I know you can do it." And then he called her a name that was inappropriate. And again, Angel felt the anger and the fear and the sadness all welling up in her stomach. And she had to go and clear her emotions again before she could do anything around working on this case. And so she took her lunch break. She went to a park and she sat under a tree and she breathed into her emotions and felt them all. And then she saw a mother and daughter having a picnic together. And she remembered her life with Eve, especially those younger years when she was Eve's whole world. And then she remembered the trick that she would always employ when she had a hard time with Eve. She remembered holding Eve in her arms and looking into her eyes and seeing that beautiful innocence. And then she got inspired and she knew that she could do the same with Carlo. She knew that she could do the same with all of her clients moving forward. She could see them as little babies, babies that could be held, babies that hadn't experienced any of the harsh and cruel circumstances of the world. And she imagined holding baby Carlo in her arms and looking into his eyes and seeing that innocence. And she knew that she could defend him, and she could defend him well. And she went to work on the case immediately after her lunch break. And she started to interview people who knew Carlo, who described what his life was like, how he grew up on the streets with no family, how he turned to prostitution at a young age, how he was routinely abused, and all of the different people who had let him down even when he was vulnerable enough to enter into a friendship or a partnership with someone. She could see now how he was no different from little Eve taking the rock and throwing it at the bully. She could see how the system needed to understand how the Carlos of the world become who they are and are capable of murder. And so she built her case around all of that. And she went to trial with Carlo. And every time she looked at him, she remembered the innocence she could see in his eyes when he was a baby. A baby that she would continue to imagine holding in her arms. And she noticed that soon Carlo wasn't being disrespectful to her, that he was actually kind to Angel, that the time he was spending in prison, awaiting his trial, and during his trial, seemed to be good for him. And as she made her closing argument in the case and talked about how Carlo was created by a society that had failed him, that his murdering this other man was tragic, but that she didn't think Carlo serving 30 years in prison was going to make the situation better. And as she spoke, it was the judge that she reached ultimately. The judge was a compassionate man. The jury came to a unanimous verdict, and Carlo was convicted of murder. But he was not angry with Angel. He saw how much she put into defending him. And at the sentencing, the judge took everything that Angel had said to heart. And Carlo only was sentenced to the minimum number of years. Angel went on to defend lots and lots of people who needed her help. And from time to time, she would even visit Carlo in prison. They would talk about an appeal, but they both knew that it was really about just getting together. She needed to see him for who he really was, and he needed to be seen. And Angel went on to have a long, illustrious career as a public defender and met many Carlos along the way. She made lots of friends, and she held lots of imaginary babies in her arms. That is the end of the story. I am Mary, Mother of Yeshua, and I am here always for each of you.